The 1970s may be remembered for disco, bell-bottoms, and arcade games. But behind the flashing lights and funky beats, television screens were lighting up a whole different kind of chaos. Cartoons weren't just silly diversions anymore. They were edgy, experimental, and sometimes downright alarming to parents who expected Saturday mornings to be safe. So, what happens when cute characters cross the line? Let's dig into the shows that shocked, rattled, and forced parents to pick up the phone in protest. Some of these stories are wilder than the cartoons themselves. Inch High, Private Eye, 1973. Imagine a detective so small he could slip under a door, sneak into your living room, and spy on conversations without being noticed. That was the premise of Inch High, Private Eye, a Hanna-Barbera creation that seemed harmless at first glance. Kids got a 1-inch-tall investigator, his niece, and their trusty dog solving mysteries. Sounds fun, right? Not for the parents. The controversy kicked in when psychologists warned that the constant danger scenes, like Inch High nearly being stepped on by cats or crushed in machinery, were not exactly Saturday morning fluff. Parents argued it made peril look normal for children. To make things worse, Inch High often relied on spying, sneaking, and breaking rules to solve cases. Critics said this encouraged kids to see snooping as clever instead of wrong. Some stations refused to rerun episodes, citing concerns about child endangerment themes. That didn't stop it from inspiring later detectives like Inspector Gadget. But for parents in the 70s, this pint-sized sleuth felt like he was teaching the wrong lessons. Inch High became proof that even the smallest cartoon hero could cause big trouble. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kids, 1973. Turning two of history's most infamous outlaws into bubblegum-chewing teenage heroes? That was the bold move Hanna-Barbera made with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kids. Instead of robbing banks, these animated versions traveled the country solving mysteries with their band. The backlash was immediate. Parents couldn't wrap their heads around criminals being rebranded as role models. The show leaned heavily into action sequences with chases, gadgets, and characters who often looked like they were one step away from another life of crime. Parent advocacy groups were especially vocal about how the cartoon blurred the line between bad guys and good guys. Stations in conservative markets even refused to air some episodes, claiming the series made outlaw behavior look fun and admirable. Critics argued the program glossed over the real legacy of the original figures and instead turned them into Saturday morning celebrities. Despite all that, the cartoon left a cultural mark, opening the door for later shows where history and fantasy collided. Still, parents of the 70s didn't want their kids thinking being like Butch was something to aspire to. CB Bears, 1977. The CB radio craze of the 70s had everyone talking, literally. Hanna-Barbera cashed in on the trend with CB Bears, a show about 3 bears who used radios to help fight crime. Sounds fun, right? But to parents and regulators, it was anything but. The problem was the way the show depicted illegal radio use. The bears regularly broadcast on frequencies that were off-limits, interfered with emergency lines, and ignored rules that real CB operators were struggling to follow. Parents and safety experts worried kids might pick up a real radio and mimic the bad habits. The backlash grew louder when actual CB enthusiasts complained that the show misrepresented how radios really worked. Some markets edited episodes to tone down the illegal chatter, but the damage was done. What seemed like a lighthearted cartoon suddenly looked like a manual on how to break communication laws. Despite the criticism, CB Bears captured the spirit of the decade's tech craze. But for parents, it was one more reason to keep a close eye on what kids were absorbing every Saturday morning. The Groovy Ghoulies, 1971. Monsters rocking out in a haunted mansion might sound like perfect comedy material, but the Groovy Ghoulies didn't exactly sit well with parents of the 70s. Created by Filmation, the show featured Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolfman as a band of jokey rock stars. What upset parents was how casual it made horror look. Vampires and werewolves weren't the scary villains kids were supposed to run from. They were suddenly comic relief and role models. Critics argued it blurred the line between danger and entertainment. Some parent groups accused the show of normalizing creepy characters and making them too appealing to young audiences. Certain stations in the American South even pulled the show from daytime slots, worried it might unsettle more conservative households. Meanwhile, the musical numbers, catchy and upbeat, made some adults fear that children were being charmed into seeing monsters as cool. In the end, the Groovy Ghoulies became one of those cartoons that adults couldn't stop complaining about, while kids couldn't stop watching. It showed just how wide the generation gap had become in the 70s. Help! It's the Hair Bear Bunch, 1971. Escape plots, disguises, and trickery filled every episode of Help. It's the Hair Bear Bunch, a Hanna-Barbera series about 3 bears trying to break out of their zoo. While kids laughed at the slapstick, parents were left uneasy. The bears constantly fooled authority figures, made caretakers look clueless, and celebrated trickery as cleverness. Critics argued this made kids think lying to adults or breaking rules was funny, even admirable. Educators were especially vocal, warning that the cartoon undermined respect for authority figures like teachers or parents. Some stations outright refused reruns, citing its anti-authority tone. The controversy highlighted a bigger cultural shift. By the early 70s, cartoons weren't just silly animal antics anymore. They reflected rebellion and mistrust of authority, echoing what was happening in real life. Despite the backlash, the show built a cult following and laid groundwork for future ensemble comedies with rebellious characters. For parents, though, Hair Bear Bunch was another example of why cartoons were no longer guaranteed safe territory. Wheelie and the Chopper Bunch, 1974. Picture a sweet little Volkswagen Beetle trying to dodge a gang of loud, aggressive motorcycles. That's the setup for Wheelie and the Chopper Bunch. On paper, it was a simple chase comedy. In practice, it rubbed a lot of parents the wrong way. The problem? The Chopper Bunch looked and acted exactly like motorcycle gangs that dominated the headlines at the time. Episodes showed non-stop road chases, crashes, and aggressive taunts, all played for laughs. Critics worried kids might start to think reckless driving was cool. Safety organizations joined the outcry, arguing that the show made high-speed chases look like fun games instead of real dangers. Some broadcasters even trimmed chase scenes to tone things down, but parents still saw the show as a gateway to glamorizing bad behavior on the road. It didn't help that the United States was in the middle of a traffic safety crisis, with campaigns urging children to respect road rules. Wheelie and the Chopper Bunch sent the exact opposite message. Still, the series had influence. Its vehicle-based antics paved the way for later franchises like Transformers. But for parents of the 70s, it was just another example of how Saturday mornings were starting to feel more like trouble than harmless fun. The Funky Phantom, 1971. What if your Scooby-Doo gang had an extra member, except this one was a Revolutionary War-era ghost? That's the idea behind The Funky Phantom, a show where 3 teens accidentally release the spirit of Jonathan Wellington, Mudsie Muddlemore, who then tags along on their adventures. Parents weren't laughing. The cartoon regularly featured seances, ghostly appearances, and direct contact with the spirit world. Critics argued it encouraged kids to treat the supernatural as a game instead of something to be cautious about. Advocacy groups claimed the show made paranormal activity look fun and harmless. The pushback was strong enough that several stations moved the series to late-night reruns, well past prime Saturday morning hours. Some households flat-out banned it, believing the ghostly gimmick was too heavy for kids. Ironically, the Funky Phantom was lighthearted compared to later cartoons with real horror undertones. But in the early 70s, even a goofy ghost with a cat sidekick was enough to set off alarms. It showed that adding spooky elements to kids' shows was always going to be a balancing act, and this one tipped too far for parents. Hong Kong Phooey. 1974. Enter a clumsy dog who works at a police station by day and fights crime with martial arts by night. That was Hong Kong Phooey, voiced by the legendary Scatman Crothers. Kids loved the wacky slapstick, the kung fu gags, and the sense of chaos. But adults? Not so much. The backlash came from how it portrayed Asian culture. Critics pointed out the exaggerated accents, fortune cookie wisdom, and over-the-top Eastern imagery that had nothing to do with real life. Advocacy groups argued that the cartoon painted a whole culture with broad, outdated brushstrokes. Television stations in parts of the United States actually pulled the show after community complaints. Internationally, some networks refused to air it at all, saying it was insensitive. Yet, for all the controversy, the cartoon stuck in pop culture memory because of its catchy theme song and goofy humor. Looking back, Hong Kong Phooey is a reminder of how cartoons of the 70s often crossed lines without realizing it. What seemed funny at the time became a case study in what not to do with cultural representation. The Great Grape Ape Show, 1975. A 40-foot-tall purple gorilla riding around in a van? What could possibly go wrong? In the Great Grape Ape Show, the oversized ape meant well, but his sheer size usually led to disasters. Crashed cars, smashed buildings, broken bridges, you name it. Grape Ape accidentally destroyed it. Parents weren't amused. They argued the show made massive destruction look harmless and funny, with no real consequences. Critics worried it sent the wrong message to children about responsibility. After all, week after week, Grape Ape flattened whole neighborhoods, and everyone just laughed it off. Some stations began editing out the worst destruction scenes, while educators complained that it encouraged kids to see breaking things as entertainment. In a decade where property damage was a real social concern, the cartoon seemed oddly tone-deaf. Still, the character's larger-than-life antics won fans, and he became part of Hanna-Barbera's broader universe. But parents couldn't shake the feeling that the Great Grape Ape Show taught kids to shrug off the mess instead of owning up to it. The Mumbly Cartoon Show, 1976. Here's a twist. Not every controversial cartoon featured spooky monsters or giant apes. Sometimes, all it took was a bumbling police dog. The Mumbly Cartoon Show followed a trench coat-wearing pup who muttered his way through detective work. The problem? He was terrible at it. Episodes regularly showed Mumbly botching cases, letting crooks get away, and creating more chaos than order. Parents and community groups said the show made law enforcement look like a joke, which hit a nerve during a time when urban crime rates were rising. Some organizations argued that showing such incompetence undermined respect for authority figures. Broadcasters in a few cities even trimmed episodes where criminals escaped, worried the message was too cynical. Despite the pushback, kids found Mumbly's clumsy antics entertaining. And while the show never hit the popularity of Scooby-Doo, it carved out a place in Hanna-Barbera's long list of talking animal detectives. For adults, though, it was one more sign that 70s cartoons were no longer safe territory for teaching kids about trust and responsibility. Jana of the Jungle, 1978. Hanna-Barbera wanted a female Tarzan for Saturday mornings, and that's how Jana of the Jungle swung onto screens. Blonde, athletic, and dressed in animal skins, Jana became the protector of an African jungle. It might have sounded empowering, but parents and cultural critics saw something else entirely. The backlash came from the way the show portrayed local tribes. Characters were written with broken English, shown as primitive, and always in need of rescue. Jana, the outsider, was the one who swooped in to solve every problem. Critics said this pushed an outdated white savior narrative at a time when society was becoming more aware of representation and fairness. Advocacy groups called the show out, demanding networks rethink how non-Western cultures were being portrayed in kid-friendly programming. Some stations in urban markets even pulled the show from schedules after protests. For kids, Jana might have been another action heroine, but for adults, the cartoon reflected deeper cultural blind spots of the decade. What was meant as progressive, finally putting a woman in the lead, ended up criticized for everything around her. It became a clear example of how good intentions in the 70s didn't always translate into sensitive storytelling. Rickety Rocket, 1979. Just as the decade was ending, Filmation launched Rickety Rocket, a space adventure with 4 teenagers and their talking robot zooming through the galaxy in a rickety spaceship. The idea was fun: independence, youth power, and exploration. But the way it played out raised eyebrows fast. Parents weren't happy about kids watching other kids take dangerous space missions with no adults in sight. Episodes had them piloting complex equipment, making life-or-death choices, and ignoring safety at every turn. Critics argued it encouraged reckless behavior and reinforced the idea that grown-ups were useless. The robot's sidekick didn't help matters, often siding with the teens against authority figures. Some stations refused to air reruns, saying the independence theme was inappropriate for young audiences. It also landed in the middle of debates about whether children's programming should encourage responsibility or rebellion. Despite the pushback, Rickety Rocket made an impression. It paved the way for later cartoons, where young heroes carried entire storylines without adults. But in 1979, it was one more reason for parents to sit closer to the TV and ask, what exactly are my kids learning from this? The New Adventures of Secret Squirrel, 1978. Spy stories were everywhere in the Cold War era, and Hanna-Barbera decided even kids should have a version. Enter The New Adventures of Secret Squirrel and Morocco Mole. On the surface, it was a goofy parody of James Bond. Underneath, it was another flashpoint for complaints. Episodes featured gadgets, espionage, and sneaky infiltration plots. Parents wondered why children's TV was suddenly filled with talk of spies, hidden weapons, and international intrigue. Psychologists warned that it could raise anxiety in kids during a time when the evening news was already dominated by real-world tension. Some broadcasters responded by trimming episodes, cutting out the heavier spy gear and focusing on slapstick humor. But the critiques kept coming. Was this really appropriate material for kids on a Saturday morning? For animation, it was groundbreaking, proving parodies could work for younger audiences. But for families in the late 70s, Secret Squirrel felt like a little too much Cold War in their cartoons. It highlighted how even comedy could stir unease when the themes mirrored real-world stress. Battle of the Planets, 1978. When American kids first saw Battle of the Planets, they didn't realize it was a heavily edited version of Japan's science ninja team Gatchaman. 5 heroes in bird costumes saving Earth from alien invaders? Perfect Saturday morning action. But the edits and the content that slipped through sparked huge backlash. The original show was dark, filled with real danger and intense fights. To make it acceptable, American producers cut out a lot, added a robot narrator, and toned down the violence. Even so, parents complained that it was still too intense for kids. The controversy grew when uncut Japanese footage began circulating, showing just how much had been removed. Suddenly, critics accused networks of both watering down the show and still exposing kids to too much. Some stations gave up and pulled it altogether. Despite all this, Battle of the Planets opened the door to anime in the United States. It was a turning point in animation history, but one that came with a mountain of parental complaints. Starblazers, 1979. Few cartoons carried as much baggage as Starblazers, adapted from Japan's space battleship Yamato. At first glance, it was a thrilling space opera. A crew on a massive battleship-turned-spaceship fighting to save Earth. But the details made it one of the most controversial imports of the decade. The ship itself was based on the Yamato, Japan's most famous World War II vessel, sunk by Allied forces. For audiences in Asia and beyond, turning that ship into a heroic space savior hit a raw nerve. Broadcasters in Toma, South Korea, and China banned the show outright, calling it inappropriate. In the United States, parents and educators had different concerns. The show's themes of military honor, sacrifice, and nationalism were considered far too heavy for children. Critics said it was basically introducing war propaganda through the back door. Despite that, Starblazers gained a loyal fan base and helped introduce serialized storytelling to American kids' shows. Still, in the late 70s, it was another reminder that cartoons weren't just slapstick anymore. They were carrying cultural weight that parents weren't ready for. Mazinger Z, 1972. If you thought giant robots were harmless toys, Mazinger Z was here to prove otherwise. This Japanese anime exploded onto screens with mechanical monsters tearing cities apart, and it didn't hold back on destruction. For parents in the 70s, it was a nightmare in cartoon form. Episodes showed intense robot battles where cities crumbled, machines lost limbs, and people were in real danger. Nothing about it felt safe compared to the usual Saturday morning lineup. Broadcasters in Europe even banned the series outright, calling it far too violent for kids. In the United States, episodes were so heavily cut down that some became hard to follow. Parents complained that the show glorified destruction and made warfare look exciting. Advocacy groups argued that constant exposure to collapsing cities and endless battles could leave children numb to real-world violence. Despite the pushback, Mazinger Z became a cornerstone of anime culture, paving the way for future franchises like Gundam and Transformers. For the 70s, though, it was the ultimate too much, too soon. Parents saw it as proof that imported cartoons were breaking all the old rules. Majokko Megu-chan, 1974. On the surface, Majokko Megu-chan looked like a sweet story of a teenage witch learning to balance school and magic. But parents quickly latched on to the central problem. It treated witchcraft like something fun and empowering for kids. Episodes showed Megu using spells, transformations, and magical lessons to navigate life. While children loved the sparkly powers, critics argued it made dabbling in the unknown look appealing. In more conservative households, parents worried it encouraged children to imitate magic at home. Some television markets refused to air the series, while others quietly shifted it out of daytime slots. Despite the controversy, the show was groundbreaking. It essentially launched the magical girl genre that would later produce massive hits like Sailor Moon. For families in the 70s, though, Megu-chan became a symbol of how quickly children's programming was drifting into themes parents weren't ready for. What kids saw as harmless fantasy, adults saw as something much more troubling. Devilman, 1972. If there was one show that truly shocked parents in the 70s, it was Devilman. This Japanese series told the story of a teenager who fuses with a demon to protect Earth. The problem? It didn't shy away from showing just how dark that struggle could get. Scenes featured intense transformations, monstrous creatures, and storylines about the fight between good and evil. For kids tuning in, it was a massive departure from the goofy comedy of Hanna-Barbera. For parents, it was pure nightmare fuel. Broadcasters around the world either heavily edited the series or banned it outright. Advocacy groups accused it of being far too disturbing, while critics argued it simply wasn't suitable for a young audience. The controversy only added to its underground reputation, making it a cult favorite among older viewers. For the animation industry, Devilman proved cartoons didn't have to be lighthearted. They could dive into darker, more mature themes. But for families of the 70s, it was one cartoon they absolutely didn't want their kids watching. Galaxy Express 999, 1978. A boy boards a train through the galaxy in search of a mechanical body. Sounds imaginative, right? But Galaxy Express 999 was more than space fantasy. It was a full-blown meditation on life, death, and what it means to be human. And that's where parents drew the line. The series introduced children to heavy themes like mortality, class struggle, and the cost of living forever. Episodes tackled issues most kids weren't even ready to think about. Psychologists criticized the cartoon for giving children existential questions way too early. Some countries restricted it to late-night programming, arguing that it was really a show for adults, not kids. Religious and community groups pushed back on its constant questioning of human nature, saying it might unsettle young viewers. Still, Galaxy Express 999 left a lasting impact. It showed that animation could handle complex storytelling, even if it rattled parents along the way. For 70s families, it was proof that cartoons were no longer guaranteed kid stuff. Which of these do you think was the most over the top? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories networks tried to hide.